The moment I walked into the club, I felt the familiar hum of power settle over me like a heavy cloak. The low murmur of conversation and the sharp tang of cigar smoke blending into the kind of atmosphere that always made me feel untouchable, invincible. And yet tonight, strangely restless, as if the air itself knew that something, or someone, was about to disrupt the carefully constructed order of my life. My boots clicked against the polished hardwood floor, echoing in the cavernous room, a sound I had learned over the years to trust as my own herald, the quiet rhythm that reminded everyone present that I was not just the man in charge, but the storm that everyone else had to navigate. And yet, even as I moved through the haze of dim golden lights and the low murmur of my men discussing deals, alliances, and betrayals with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from long, bloodied experience, my attention was inexplicably drawn to a single figure across the room, standing in a pool of soft light near the bar, and I knew instantly that she would change everything. Her name was Lena, though the syllables felt too light for someone who carried such weight, such an unspoken authority in the subtle tilt of her chin, the slow, deliberate way she rested her hand against the smooth wood of the bar, and the way her eyes, sharp and dark, flicked toward me with a mixture of curiosity and caution that ignited something inside me that I had long thought dead. A spark that I tried to smother with cold calculation, but it refused to be ignored. She was the kind of woman who didn't just enter a room. She claimed it quietly, without force, without shouting. And yet everyone present, myself included, could feel the pull of her presence as if some invisible gravity emanated from her every movement, every deliberate glance, every subtle curve of her body, draped in that dress that clung to her in all the right ways, without ever seeming to try. I approached her slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of a dangerous respect for the effect she had on me. A recognition that this woman was capable of unraveling the careful control I had spent years constructing around myself. The hum of my men faded into the background, the conversations melting into white noise, because the world had condensed to the narrow space between her eyes and mine, where I could see the glint of mischief, the shadow of fear, and something else. Something dangerous that I didn't yet understand, but that made my pulse hammer with a mix of anticipation and warning. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost lilting, and yet it carried the weight of someone who was used to being heard, someone who had learned the subtle art of control without ever raising a fist, without ever needing to declare her dominion. And I felt my chest tighten, because in that moment I realized I was no longer the hunter. I was the prey, caught willingly in her orbit, mesmerized by a force I had no intention of resisting. "Good evening," she said, her tone casual, almost playful. And yet it struck me with the precision of a blade, cutting through every layer of armor I had carefully wrapped around myself, leaving me raw, exposed, and craving something I couldn't name. "I've been waiting," I murmured, the words slipping out before I could catch them, and I cursed the unexpected vulnerability in my own voice, the way my heart betrayed me with a quickened rhythm that I had not felt in years, perhaps ever, because I had built my life on control, on fear, on dominance, and yet this woman, this impossibly beautiful, enigmatic, and infuriatingly unattainable woman, had already stolen something from me that no amount of violence or intimidation could ever reclaim. We talked then, and every word between us felt like a negotiation of power, a dance where neither of us revealed our true hand, yet with every glance, every subtle brush of her fingers against mine, I felt my carefully curated walls crumble in ways I couldn't allow, yet could not stop. I learned the way her laugh could disarm me, a sound so rich and unguarded that it threatened to undo years of calculated self-preservation. And I learned how her eyes held secrets that she wasn't willing to share, mysteries tucked behind lashes and smiles, the kind of secrets that make a man desperate without him even realizing it, until the desperation has already taken root and begun to grow like poison in his veins. My men noticed, of course, as men always notice when something or someone shifts the gravity of a room. But I ignored them, because nothing outside of Lena mattered at that moment. Not the deals I had to approve, not the threats that waited patiently in the shadows of the city, not the endless calculations of alliances and betrayals that made me feared and respected in equal measure. She was the anomaly, the variable I had not anticipated, and I was helpless to resist her pull. The way she moved with grace, the way she listened, the way she spoke, the way she seemed both dangerously near and impossibly distant all at once. And yet, even in the intensity of our connection, there was a flicker, a hesitation, a subtle tremor in the edges of her smile that I couldn't place, a whisper in the way she touched her glass, a shadow in the way her eyes darted when someone mentioned my business, a hesitation that sparked a spark of caution in me, a faint, nagging suspicion that something about her was not what it seemed, and I pushed it aside, because desire is a stronger force than logic. And in that room, with her leaning toward me slightly, the faint scent of her perfume curling around my senses, the world could have burned down outside and I would not have noticed. When our hands brushed briefly, the electricity was undeniable, a jolt that ran straight through me, grounding me and unraveling me simultaneously. And I knew then that this woman was no mere distraction, no fleeting thrill to be conquered and discarded. She was a storm, unpredictable, overwhelming, and terrifyingly beautiful. And I realized with a shiver that I wanted nothing more than to step into the heart of it, to surrender to the chaos she brought into my life even as the tiniest voice in my head screamed that surrendering to her could very well be my undoing. And as the night wore on, the haze of cigar smoke thickening, the low hum of conversation fading further into a distant murmur, and her laughter lingering like a dangerous melody in my mind, I could not shake the certainty that my life, meticulously ordered and violently controlled, was about to be irrevocably changed. That this woman, her every look, every word, every fleeting touch, was about to pull me into a game I could not win without losing something I had spent my life guarding, and perhaps even losing myself. I should have walked away, should have maintained the careful distance that had kept me alive in this world for so long. But I didn't. I couldn't. And in that instant, I knew with a clarity that cut sharper than any blade that the only choice I had was to follow her, to let myself be consumed, and to discover just how far this fire would burn before it either destroyed us both or consumed us entirely. And as I left the club that night, my mind a storm of desire and suspicion, the memory of her gaze burned into my vision. I could not imagine what lay ahead, only that the game had begun, and there would be no turning back. Because I had seen her, and she had seen me. And in that moment I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The morning after meeting her, the city felt different, as though the air itself had shifted, charged with a tension I hadn't realized I had been living without, because in the world I inhabit, where loyalty is measured in blood and fear, and alliances are stitched together with violence and whispered threats, there is little room for disruption. And yet Lena had arrived and upended all of it with the simplest of gestures. A tilt of her head, the faint curve of her smile, the almost imperceptible quiver in her hands when she reached for her glass. And I couldn't shake the certainty that she had already claimed a territory within me that no one, not even my most trusted men, would ever touch. I arrived at my office, the sun cutting through the blinds in long, harsh lines that painted the room in gold and shadow. And I found myself restless, pacing across the room in a rhythm that matched the pulse at the back of my skull, because the memory of her laugh, that intoxicating, melodic sound, was still echoing in my ears, and the way she had looked at me, as though she could see past the layers of power, intimidation, and brutality I wore like armor, unsettled me more than any threat I had faced in my career. And I realized with a clarity that was almost frightening that she had become both a temptation and a threat. A spark that could ignite everything I had built and burn it to ash if I allowed it to. By the time I reached the main floor of my headquarters, the familiar chatter of my men negotiating shipments, discussing the latest threats from rival families, and casually brandishing guns as if they were extensions of their own hands. It should have grounded me, reminded me of the life I had carved with patience, cunning, and ruthlessness, but instead, it all felt like background noise. A dull hum beneath the sharp, insistent pulse of thoughts about her. Thoughts that refused to be tamed, that followed me with a precision that bordered on obsession. And I knew then that my world, meticulously ordered and mercilessly controlled, was no longer mine alone. She arrived just before noon, as if she could sense the precise moment I would be most vulnerable, stepping into the room with a confidence that was both unsettling and irresistible, her coat slipping from her shoulders like water, revealing the curve of her body that had already taken root in my memory. And the subtle sway of her hips was enough to make me forget the cold calculation that had always been my closest ally, because desire, when it is this insistent, refuses to be ignored. And I found myself watching her with a mixture of fascination and caution, aware that even a man like me could be undone by a single glance, a single movement, a single word that carried the weight of promise and danger in equal measure. "Good morning," she said lightly, her voice cutting through the hum of activity, and the way she smiled, casual and unguarded, made my chest tighten with a strange, unfamiliar ache, because for the first time in years I felt something that was not entirely fear, respect, or dominance, but something far more treacherous, a longing that threatened to compromise every principle I had relied upon to survive in this world. And I realized, with a shiver that ran through me, that I had already crossed the line from control to obsession without even noticing. I led her through the office, past men who barely looked up, accustomed to my authority, accustomed to the way I commanded the room with presence alone. And yet even in their indifference, I could feel the tension, the subtle shift in posture, the almost imperceptible lowering of eyes when they caught sight of her, because they recognized, as I did, that she was different, that she carried a power of her own that was not rooted in violence or fear, but in the kind of dangerous allure that could unravel even the most disciplined of men if allowed. And I smiled to myself, because it thrilled me, terrified me, and confirmed that the only person who mattered in that room, beyond myself, was her. We reached my private office, a room lined with books, bottles of aged whiskey, and weapons displayed like art, and I gestured for her to sit across from me, feeling a tension coil in my chest as I watched her, every line of her body poised in a way that suggested readiness, anticipation, and a subtle, almost imperceptible nervousness that I found more intoxicating than any of the vices I had indulged in over the years, because it reminded me that beneath the veneer of control, beneath the careful armor she seemed to wear, there was a human being, someone capable of fear, desire, and loyalty, and I was determined to discover which of these she would surrender to me. "Tell me about yourself," I said, my tone deceptively casual, masking the way my mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, because I wanted to know everything. Yet I feared the answers, feared the truths that might shatter the fragile illusion I had constructed in which she belonged to me in some way, even if only fleetingly. And she hesitated for just a heartbeat before speaking, her eyes flicking toward mine, holding mine as though daring me to see through her carefully crafted facade. And I realized that this was more than a conversation. It was a negotiation, a test, a dangerous dance of power and attraction that could leave either of us exposed and vulnerable if we misstepped. Her words were measured, each one chosen with precision, revealing glimpses of her life, her ambitions and her fears, yet always leaving a shadow, a space between the lines where I knew the truth lurked, elusive and tantalizing. and I found myself leaning closer, drawn in despite every warning that had ever been drilled into me about women, about trust, about the necessity of control, because there was something in the way she spoke, something in the curve of her lips, the flash of her eyes, that promised both ecstasy and danger in equal measure, and I was powerless to resist. By the time she left, the afternoon had grown heavy with a golden haze. The city beyond my windows muted in comparison to the storm raging in my chest, and I realized with a clarity that left me both exhilarated and unnerved that I was no longer capable of treating her as a casual encounter, a fleeting distraction, or a pawn in the games of power that defined my life, because she had claimed a part of me that I did not know could be claimed, and the thought of her out of my reach, even for a single hour, was enough to make my pulse spike and my mind spiral with possibilities, both intoxicating and terrifying. I called my consigliere immediately, not to discuss business, not to consolidate power, but to ensure that she was safe, that she was being watched, because even the faintest threat to her presence in my life was intolerable, and I realized then, with a sense of inevitability that chilled me to the bone, that this was no longer merely about desire, it was about control, obsession, and the dangerous thrill of vulnerability. And that thrill, once tasted, could never be unlearned. And as night fell over the city, painting the skyline in blood red and gold, I found myself pacing my office again, unable to settle, unable to concentrate, haunted by the memory of her touch, the warmth of her hand, the sharp brilliance of her mind. And I knew that the coming days would demand more than vigilance. They would demand surrender, risk, and a willingness to navigate a world in which love, obsession, and danger were inextricably intertwined. And I felt the first, dangerous stirrings of a truth I could not yet name but would soon have to confront. That in Lena, I had found both my greatest weakness and my most irresistible desire, and that neither of us would survive untouched by the game we were about to play. Because tomorrow, I realized with a mixture of fear and anticipation that refused to be denied, she would be meeting my inner circle, the men who demanded loyalty above all else, men who would notice her, who would challenge her, and who would test the boundaries I had spent years enforcing. And I knew, with a certainty that sent a shiver down my spine, that when she walked into that room, everything would change, and there would be no turning back from the storm she had already unleashed in my life. And I could not wait to see it unfold. I had always known that power was a dangerous game, that control was a fragile illusion held together by fear, respect, and the occasional display of force that reminded the world exactly who I was. But nothing, no negotiation, no hit, no carefully orchestrated demonstration of dominance, had ever prepared me for the way Lena altered the equation. Because the moment she walked into the war-torn corners of my empire, moving with that effortless confidence that made men both deferential and envious, I realized that the rules I had mastered no longer applied, that desire and danger were now intertwined in ways that left me exhilarated and terrified in equal measure, and I had no choice but to follow her into the storm she had already begun to stir. It began with the shipment, a routine transfer of goods that my men had handled countless times, planned with the precision of a surgeon. And yet the moment I arrived at the warehouse on the outskirts of the city, I knew something was off. The air electric with tension, the shadows deeper, more menacing than usual, the faint scent of gasoline and dust mingling with the unmistakable tang of impending violence. And I realized in that instant that we were being watched, tested, and possibly baited into a trap that could either cost me everything or prove the mettle of those I trusted most, including Lena, whose presence at my side was both a relief and an unspoken challenge, because while every fiber of my being screamed for me to protect her, every instinct told me that she was more capable than I had any right to assume. She arrived moments before the ambush became evident, slipping into the warehouse with that quiet, almost predatory grace that had already begun to unsettle me, and I found my eyes lingering on her longer than reason allowed, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the way her hair caught the dim light, and the subtle flex of her muscles. beneath the fitted coat she wore, because even in that moment, when danger was imminent, she radiated a confidence that was intoxicating and infuriating, a reminder that she belonged neither entirely to me nor entirely to anyone else, and that made the thought of losing her unbearable in ways I could not yet name. Then it happened. The first shot rang out, sharp and jarring, ricocheting off the metal walls with a shriek that set my nerves alight, and my men responded instinctively, diving for cover, guns drawn, shouting commands in a chaos I had orchestrated countless times but never experienced with such a potent mix of fear and exhilaration, because this was no longer about business or reputation. This was survival, and the stakes had suddenly become intensely personal. I felt Lena beside me, her hand brushing against mine for just a fraction of a second, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through me so powerful that I nearly lost focus, nearly let my carefully honed instincts slip in the face of her nearness. And I realized then that she had become both my anchor and my undoing, a paradox I could neither resist nor rationalize, because in this world, attachments are weaknesses, and yet I could not deny the pull of hers. The ambushers were relentless, moving with a precision that suggested prior knowledge of my operation, their guns trained on us, their movements deliberate and coordinated, and yet Lena adapted as if she had anticipated every step, her eyes scanning the room, calculating, responding, directing my men with commands that I hadn't expected, a fluidity and skill that made my blood run hot with both admiration and suspicion, because no ordinary woman could move like this under fire. No ordinary companion could think with such precision when every second might mean life or death. And I found myself questioning the nature of the loyalty, skill, and intentions I had assumed about her, even as I fought side by side with her against our attackers. I shouted orders, my voice cutting through the din, my gun moving with the practiced fluidity of years spent surviving in a world where hesitation means death. And yet I couldn't ignore the way my eyes kept finding hers, tracking her movements, measuring her reactions, trying to decipher the mystery she carried in her every gesture, because she was more than just a partner in that moment of chaos. She was a force unto herself, unpredictable, intelligent, and undeniably magnetic. And the thought of underestimating her had never been more impossible, nor more dangerous. The fight lasted only minutes, though in the adrenaline-soaked haze it felt like hours. Every shot, every shout, every sudden movement amplifying the intensity of the bond forming between us, a connection forged in danger, desire, and the unspoken acknowledgement that we relied on each other in ways that went beyond loyalty, beyond trust, beyond understanding. And as the final attacker fell, leaving the warehouse in an eerie, charged silence, I felt my knees weaken slightly. Not from exhaustion, but from the raw, almost primal relief of having her survive this, having her at my side, and knowing that she had proven herself capable, not only in a fight, but in a way that made me question every assumption I had made about the fragile boundary between desire and danger. Afterward, when the echoes of gunfire had faded and the men were securing the site, I found myself drawing her aside, pressing her into a shadowed corner where the dust and faint smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air, and I could feel the tremor in her fingers as I held her close, the warmth of her body pressed against mine, the rapid beat of her pulse visible beneath the thin fabric of her coat, and I realized that in that instant, the line between protector and captor, between lover and soldier, had blurred into something unrecognizable, something that thrilled me and terrified me in equal measure. Her eyes met mine, wide, defiant, vulnerable, and I felt a rush of emotion that was almost foreign to me: pride, relief, longing, obsession, and an inescapable pull that reminded me painfully that I was no longer the untouchable force I had believed myself to be, because she had embedded herself into my life with a subtlety that left me both breathless and irrevocably compromised. And I realized that whatever came next, whatever storms the world threw at us, whatever truths lay hidden behind the calm surface of her gaze, I would follow her into it, willingly and recklessly, because the idea of letting her go had become unimaginable. And as we stood there, bodies pressed together in the dim glow of the warehouse, surrounded by the aftermath of violence and the faint echo of our shared survival, I caught a glimpse of something in her expression. Something fleeting, almost imperceptible, a shadow of hesitation, a flicker of guilt, a hint of something she was holding back from me. And it pricked at the edges of my mind, a nagging whisper I could not ignore. A reminder that desire, no matter how consuming, can blind a man to the truths that lurk beneath the surface, and that in Lena, there were layers I had yet to uncover. Secrets that had the potential to change everything I thought I knew about her, about loyalty, about trust, and about the dangerous, intoxicating thrill that came from loving a woman capable of surviving a battle without me even realizing the full extent of her skill. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the skeletal remains of the warehouse, and I watched her move with the fluid grace of someone who belonged equally to danger and beauty, I knew with a certainty that left my chest tight and my mind restless that the next steps we took together would force me to confront truths I was unprepared for, to navigate a world where love and survival were inseparable, and where the very woman I desired with a ferocity I could neither deny nor control might hold secrets so profound that they could shatter everything I had built, including the fragile hold I thought I had over my own heart. Because Lena had survived the fight, had proved herself in the crucible of chaos, and yet, in the quiet moments afterward, I saw the faintest shadow of something I could not place, a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation in her eyes that promised a revelation so dangerous, so utterly transformative that I knew without doubt that the game we had just begun was only the first move in a series of maneuvers that would test our trust, our loyalty, and the boundaries of the obsession that already bound us together. And I understood, with a clarity that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts spiral, that the real danger had not come from the men who had tried to kill us, but from the woman I thought I knew, the woman who had become the center of my world, and the woman who would either be my greatest ally or my ultimate undoing, because tomorrow, and every day after that, I would be forced to confront the truth she had not yet revealed, a truth that would change everything. And I found myself unable to imagine facing it without her by my side, even if her side held secrets that could destroy me completely. The days after the warehouse incident felt like walking through a city painted in fire and shadow. Every corner, every alley, every whispered conversation carrying the weight of danger and desire, because I could no longer separate the rhythms of my life from the pull of Lena's presence, a pull that had become a force unto itself, insistent, consuming, and undeniably dangerous. And I found myself measuring every moment, every glance, every subtle inflection of her voice with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to read people, learning to discern friend from foe, truth from lie, while simultaneously feeling powerless in the face of the magnetic gravity she exerted on me without even trying. She had begun arriving at the office regularly, accompanying me to meetings with my men, sitting quietly in the corners of rooms where deals were made and alliances forged and broken with the precision of surgeons wielding knives, and I watched her, every subtle movement, every faint smile, every carefully controlled gesture, with a mixture of fascination and suspicion, because there were moments, fleeting as shadows in the sun, when she seemed almost too calculated, almost too poised, almost too perfect. And those moments made my pulse spike with a dangerous combination of desire and unease, because in a world built on betrayal and survival, perfection is rarely natural and rarely safe. I found myself scrutinizing her interactions with my men, observing the way she tilted her head when they spoke, the way her eyes lingered on certain details, the way she offered words of encouragement, subtle, almost imperceptible yet precise in their effect. And I realized with a jolt that she was not just present. She was influencing the environment, shaping it subtly, bending it to her will without a single raised voice, without a single overt display of power. And the thought both thrilled me and gnawed at the edges of my control, because I had built an empire on the assumption that no one could touch it, that no one could touch me. And yet here was a woman doing exactly that with nothing more than a glance, a word, and a poised movement of her body. At night, when the city lights painted long streaks of gold and red across the walls of my office, I found myself alone with her in moments that were never entirely planned, moments that happened simply because she lingered, because the distance between us had become intolerable, because desire and obsession had replaced caution and reason. And in those moments I would study her face, memorizing the curve of her jaw, the tilt of her lips, the flicker in her eyes that hinted at emotions she refused to name, and I would feel a storm rise inside me, a storm that threatened to undo the careful control I had spent years cultivating. Because in Lena, I saw both the possibility of ecstasy and the promise of devastation, and I could not separate the two. And yet, even in the midst of this obsession, the doubts began to whisper, subtle, insidious, and impossible to ignore, because perfection rarely exists without intent, and intent rarely exists without a purpose that is hidden, unseen, and potentially fatal. And I found myself noticing inconsistencies, fleeting moments when her story didn't quite align, when her hand lingered over her phone longer than necessary, when her eyes darted toward the corners of rooms as if searching for something, or someone, I could not yet identify. And each of these small, almost imperceptible anomalies became a thread I could not resist pulling, because I had spent my life untangling webs of deception, and the idea that she might be hiding something of enormous consequence ignited the most dangerous and exhilarating part of me. The part that thrives on knowing, on controlling, on uncovering truths that others wish to bury. I began asking questions subtly, carefully, weaving them into conversations that seemed casual, as though I were curious rather than suspicious, and I watched her reactions, noting the slight hesitation before her answers, the way her eyes flickered to the shadows of the room, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw when pressed too hard, and each time she lied, or perhaps bent the truth. I felt a cold thrill, because the danger she represented was intoxicating, a delicious poison that I could not resist, and I realized with an intensity that left my chest tight and my mind racing that desire without danger is never desire at all, and that Lena embodied both in a way that made every moment with her both a gift and a threat. I began to dig deeper, using the tools at my disposal, the network of informants, the whispers of those who had crossed paths with her before she entered my life, and while I found nothing overt, nothing that screamed betrayal, I found fragments, pieces of a puzzle that did not quite fit the picture she had painted of herself, and each fragment only strengthened my conviction that beneath the laughter, beneath the charm, beneath the dangerous allure of her presence, there was something she was guarding fiercely, a secret so significant that its revelation could alter everything I believed about her, about loyalty, about trust, and perhaps even about myself. And yet in the midst of this growing suspicion, my obsession with her deepened, because the danger only made the attraction sharper, more immediate, more consuming, and I found myself imagining her in every conceivable scenario, not simply as a woman to possess, but as a partner in chaos, a force alongside me in a world where few could survive, and even fewer could thrive. And I knew with a certainty that frightened me that I was already too far gone to retreat, too entangled to pull back, and too captivated to resist, because she had become a part of me in ways that transcended logic, reason, and even survival. I confronted myself in the quiet moments, in the long hours where the city slept and the shadows crept across my walls, and I asked whether I was blinded by desire, whether I was foolish to trust even a fraction of what she allowed me to see, whether the thrill of her presence had already compromised me in ways I could never repair. And the answers terrified me, because I knew the truth. I did not care if she was dangerous, deceitful, or capable of betrayal, because the thought of losing her, even for a heartbeat, was more terrifying than the prospect of any enemy, any ambush, any blood-soaked confrontation I had faced in my life. And so I waited, observing, probing, testing, yet never crossing the line too far, because I was a man of control, and control had always been my greatest weapon, my sharpest advantage. And yet with Lena, I discovered that control is a fragile thing, easily shattered by a glance, a touch, or the knowledge that the person you desire most may not belong entirely to you. That even as she laughed softly, smiled faintly, and leaned close in moments that sent every nerve ending alight, she was keeping parts of herself away from me, shielding truths I could not yet see, and the realization made my blood run hot with both longing and the most delicious, dangerous anxiety. And when she left that night, the city stretched in darkness beneath my windows, and the shadows crept across my walls like silent witnesses to my obsession. I found myself replaying every detail of her presence, every carefully constructed smile, every subtle shift of weight, every glance that lingered just a moment too long or too briefly, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes from the edges of desire and suspicion colliding, that I was now caught in a game that I could neither control nor escape, and that the next move, the next revelation, would define everything. Because in Lena, I had discovered a mystery I could not resist, a danger I could not turn away from, and a desire that refused to be denied. And I knew with a thrill that made my pulse spike and my chest ache with a mix of fear and longing, that the next time she moved within my world, the truth she had been guarding would begin to slip, and the game we had begun in shadows and desire would reach a turning point that neither of us could predict, a point where the stakes would rise higher than they ever had before, and where every secret, every hesitation, every flicker of her gaze would matter more than life, more than loyalty, and more than love. Because in Lena, I had found both the greatest thrill of my life and the most dangerous unknown. And I knew with every fiber of my being that the only way forward was to dive deeper, to test her, to see what lay beneath the surface, and to discover whether the woman I desired with a ferocity that defied reason was my greatest ally or my ultimate undoing. I had always prided myself on knowing everything that happened in my world, on seeing the slightest shift in allegiance before it could manifest, on reading the tiniest ripple of hesitation on a man's face and understanding exactly what it meant. Yet for the first time in years, for the first time in my life, I was forced to confront the horrifying, intoxicating truth that I could be blind, that I could be deceived, that even the woman I wanted with every fiber of my being, the woman who had become the axis upon which my life now spun, might be hiding a reality so devastating that it would upend everything I had built. And it began with a whisper, so small that it could have been dismissed, so subtle that it might have been my own imagination, yet it carried the weight of a guillotine poised over my carefully controlled world. It started with her phone, innocuous in my hands at first, a fleeting opportunity when she had left it on the table, a habit I had noticed but had never pressed because I had trusted her, or thought I had. And yet curiosity, that dark, insatiable impulse that had always been my most faithful companion in both love and war, compelled me to glance at it, compelled me to take just a moment to see what she hid behind the screen. And what I found was a series of encrypted messages, numbers, and coded words that made my pulse spike with an adrenaline I hadn't felt since my first contract. Since the first time I realized that betrayal was always closer than the nearest knife, and that the very person I craved with an intensity that defied reason might not be mine at all, might never have been mine at all. And that realization made my chest tighten, my hands tremble, and my mind spin with 1,000 possibilities, all of them dangerous, all of them irresistible. I spent the next hours in which the city's heartbeat seemed to sync with my own. A low, dangerous rhythm of power, lust, and suspicion, studying her, watching the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way her laughter spilled across rooms like sunlight in winter, and every detail that had once seemed to mark her as perfect, natural, and alluring now carried the sharp edge of uncertainty, of deliberate construction, of intent. And I felt a part of me fracture, not in fear, not in weakness, but in the exquisite, agonizing tension that comes when desire collides with betrayal, when love and suspicion entwine in ways that leave a man unable to separate the two. I confronted myself quietly, in the solitude of my office where shadows pooled in corners like conspirators, and asked the questions I had been too afraid to speak aloud. Could I have been so blind? Could I have misread every glance, every smile, every touch, every word as truth when it had been calculated, measured, designed to ensnare me? And the answer, though unwelcome and terrifying, was undeniable. Yes. I had been blind. I had been utterly, deliciously blind, seduced by the combination of skill, beauty, and danger that she wielded as easily as I wielded power. And in that blindness, I had allowed myself to be vulnerable in a way I had never permitted before. And the thought of that vulnerability, of the possibility that she had never belonged to me at all, struck through me like a blade of ice wrapped in fire, leaving me raw, trembling, and hungering for answers I was not sure I wanted. I began testing her, subtly, like a predator circling the edge of a kill zone, posing questions that were innocuous on the surface but laced with the possibility of detection, watching her reactions, reading the subtlest flickers of her pupils, the slight tightening of her jaw, the fraction of hesitation before her words came, and I felt the thrill, sharp and dangerous, of discovering that beneath the surface of the woman I wanted, beneath the warmth and laughter and intoxicating allure, there was something else, something hidden, something that could destroy me with a precision I had never before encountered, and the awareness of that truth both terrified and electrified me, because I had never been a man capable of surrendering to uncertainty, and yet here I was, enthralled by it, addicted to it, unable to resist. The whispers of my trusted men reached me next. Fragments of overheard conversations, the subtle shifts in loyalty I had learned to detect years ago. And when one of my lieutenants, a man whose loyalty was second only to my own, leaned close and murmured, "Boss? I don't trust her." My heart did not jump with anger, but with something darker, more potent, fear wrapped in desire, the awareness that even those I trusted could sense the instability she brought into my life, and that the very foundation of my empire, my control, my carefully measured world, was vulnerable in ways I had not anticipated, because Lena's presence, as intoxicating as it was, carried the weight of betrayal waiting to erupt. I didn't confront her immediately, not with accusations, not with rage, not with fear, because that would have been to play her game on her terms, and I was no man who could afford that luxury, no man who would willingly allow the woman he desired to manipulate him without provocation. And so I watched, I waited, I maneuvered, each glance, each word, each touch a subtle probe into the truth of her intentions, and every moment spent near her was a delicious torment, a collision of lust and suspicion, desire and fear, obsession and reason, until the tension was nearly unbearable, until the air itself seemed to hum with the charge of everything unsaid, everything hidden, and everything that could erupt in violence, passion, or revelation at any instant. And then she came to me. The evening thick and heavy with the scent of rain and smoke from the city beyond my walls, her eyes wide and cautious, her body poised in a way that suggested both defiance and vulnerability. And I realized, with a clarity that made my pulse hammer and my chest tighten, that the time for subtlety was over, that the moment to confront the reality I had long suspected was inevitable, and that whatever truth she carried, whatever danger she embodied, it would no longer be contained, because desire had become obsession, suspicion had become fire, and I could not allow either to lie dormant any longer without risking the complete unraveling of both my heart and my world. "Tell me," I said, my voice low, deliberate, a blend of command and longing that left no room for evasion, and I saw the flicker in her eyes, that slight hesitation that I had learned to recognize as a prelude to truth, or deception, and it cut through me like a blade of ice and flame, because in that hesitation lay everything I had feared, everything I had hoped for, and everything I had not yet dared to acknowledge, and I knew then, with a certainty that left me both trembling and exhilarated, that whatever came next would define the boundaries of trust, loyalty, desire, and obsession in ways I could not yet predict, and that the woman I loved, or thought I loved, was about to reveal a piece of herself that would change the rules of the game entirely. Because in that moment, as her lips parted, as her eyes sought mine with a mixture of fear, defiance, and longing, I realized with a chill that ran straight through my veins that the truth I had been circling, the secret she had been guarding so carefully, was about to surface, and that the line between love and betrayal, obsession and control, desire and devastation, had narrowed to a razor's edge, and I was teetering on it, helpless, entranced, and utterly, irrevocably alive. And I knew then, as I waited for her next words, that nothing would ever be the same, that the storm she carried with her would engulf us both, and that the real danger, more thrilling, more terrifying than any rival, any betrayal, any bloodshed I had faced, was about to reveal itself in a way I could neither predict nor escape. I had walked through fire before, through gunfire and betrayal, through nights drenched in blood and the whispers of men who thought themselves untouchable. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for the way the world twisted beneath my feet the moment I realized that the woman I had claimed, the woman I had desired with a ferocity I could neither deny nor resist, was not merely a woman, not merely a companion, not merely someone who had walked into my life to disturb it with her beauty and her danger, but a weapon, a blade forged in deceit, crafted to pierce the very heart of my empire. And I felt the weight of that knowledge like lead pressing down on my chest, suffocating, thrilling, and unbearably intoxicating all at once. I confronted her in the privacy of my office, the city's nightlights painting long, jagged shadows across the walls, highlighting the contours of her face in a way that made my pulse hammer with desire and dread simultaneously. And I could not look away, could not temper the fire that roared inside me, even as suspicion coiled like a viper around my instincts. And I realized, with a cold, electrifying clarity, that this moment would define everything between us. The love, the obsession, the betrayal, and the dangerous, consuming desire that had bound us together since the first night I had seen her, a force I had believed I could control until now. "Why?" I demanded, my voice low, harsh, every syllable carrying the weight of years spent building power and controlling my world, yet tinged with the raw vulnerability I refused to show anyone else, a vulnerability that I could no longer suppress in her presence, because the truth had ripped through every carefully constructed layer of my life, exposing me in ways I had spent decades learning to conceal. And yet I could not turn away from her, could not deny the magnetic pull of her gaze that held both fear and longing, both honesty and deception. And I knew with a clarity that made my blood run hot that she had anticipated this moment, that she had prepared for it as much as I had, and that made the confrontation all the more dangerous, all the more intoxicating. She swallowed, her throat moving nervously, though the rest of her posture radiated the kind of poise and control that I had already learned to admire, to fear, and to crave. And her eyes met mine with a mixture of defiance, desperation, and something else, something I could not name, something that made my chest ache even as it ignited the fire of my obsession. And in that instant, I realized that she was more than a spy, more than a threat, more than a temptation. She was a force, one that had inserted itself into the very center of my world and refused to leave, and I was helpless, willing and eager to let her stay. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said finally, her voice a whisper that trembled, between fear and confession. a sound that should have broken me but instead ignited every nerve in my body with a dangerous combination of rage and longing, because I could hear the truth in her tone, the vulnerability she could not fully mask. And I knew in that instant that she had fallen into the same trap as me, into the fire of desire, into the gravity of something bigger than herself, something she could not resist. And that realization made me both want to destroy her and hold her closer than I ever thought possible. "Do you have any idea what this means?" I growled, pacing the room with a precision that mirrored my inner turmoil, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, the muscles in my jaw taut with fury and desperation, because I had allowed myself to love her in ways I had promised myself I never would, had allowed her into the core of my life and my empire. And now every instinct, every learned caution, every carefully constructed plan of power and control screamed at me that I had been betrayed. And yet even as the words left my mouth, I realized I could not stop the surge of desire, the magnetic pull that made my body ache with the need to claim her, to punish her, and to keep her simultaneously, all at once. She flinched at my words, at the weight of my anger, at the raw, dangerous intensity of the man she had sought to infiltrate and who now stood before her, unmasked, unrestrained, and utterly consumed by both fury and obsession. And she took a step toward me, a bold, defiant, fragile step that sent a shiver down my spine, because in that movement she revealed the truth I had suspected, the confession she had not yet spoken aloud. She had indeed fallen into the same trap, the trap of feeling, of wanting, of being consumed by the man who could have destroyed her in a heartbeat, and yet had not. "I didn't plan to love you," she admitted, her words spilling out with a rawness that made my chest constrict, because I understood the paradox, the dangerous impossibility of it, the way she had walked into my world to manipulate it, and had instead been manipulated herself by the force of something she could not resist. And I felt my anger twist, folding over into desire, into obsession, into the reckless, intoxicating need to press her against the wall, to see her trembling beneath me, and to hear her confess in a way that went beyond words, beyond calculation, beyond reason. "You were supposed to be a spy," I said, my tone low, harsh, trembling with emotion I had spent years suppressing. And yet I could not mask the hunger that laced every word, because the truth of her identity, the danger of her presence, and the fire of her desire had combined into a single, lethal force that left me both terrified and unwilling to look away, unwilling to resist, and fully aware that even in anger, even in fury, even in the ache of betrayal, I wanted her more than I had ever wanted anything else in my life. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, shimmering with unshed tears, and she reached for me, her hands tentative but insistent, a gesture that was both plea and confession. And I caught her, pressed her against me, and felt her tremble under the weight of both my anger and my desire, a trembling that mirrored my own, because I was shaking with the intensity of everything I had allowed her to provoke in me, everything I had allowed her to become in my life. And I realized with a clarity that left me breathless that the very woman I wanted, the woman I could not live without, had already penetrated the deepest parts of me, and there was no turning back from the truth, no undoing the fire she had ignited. "I didn't choose this," she whispered, and I could feel the tremor of truth in her voice, the confession that she had not meant to fall into the gravity of my life, that she had tried to control, to manipulate, to survive, and yet had been undone by the force of something far greater than her plans, her intentions, or even her training. And I realized, with a mixture of rage and hunger that made my body ache, that the woman I loved, if love was still the right word, was both my greatest betrayal and my ultimate salvation, because she had become the center of my world, the axis of my obsession, the force around which every thought, every breath, every heartbeat now revolved. And in that moment, as the city lights flickered against the windows, as shadows twisted across the room, as her lips brushed mine in a trembling, hesitant kiss that was both confession and seduction. I understood, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that nothing could undo the fire between us, nothing could erase the truth of her existence in my life, and nothing could prepare me for the storm we were about to face, together and yet, in many ways, divided by the secrets that had always defined us, because desire, obsession, and danger had now intertwined in a way that left no room for retreat, no possibility of denial, and no future without reckoning. And as I held her close, feeling the tremor of her body beneath mine, feeling the undeniable pull of her presence in a way that consumed every rational thought, I knew with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was thrilling that our story had just begun, that every step forward would be a battle between trust and deception, love and obsession, and that the game we were playing was no longer one of subtle seduction, but of survival, desire, and the dangerous, intoxicating collision of two forces neither of us could escape. Because she had betrayed me, and yet she was mine. And I could not, would not, let her go. The days after the revelation were a storm I could not escape, a hurricane that tore through every certainty I had clung to, every control I had believed untouchable, because knowing Lena had entered my life as a spy should have made my blood boil with rage, should have sharpened every edge of my fury. Yet instead, it only deepened the chaos that already resided in my chest, a chaos that was equal parts desire, obsession, and the dark thrill of vulnerability I had long convinced myself I would never allow to exist. And in those moments, I realized with a clarity that both terrified and exhilarated me, that the woman who had infiltrated my world had also infiltrated my heart, leaving it exposed, raw, and dangerously alive in ways I had never imagined possible. I watched her move through my mansion, through the empire I had built on blood and fear, and I could not decide whether to crush her in my arms or interrogate her until the truth was stripped bare, because she carried herself with a poise that suggested both defiance and fear, mastery and vulnerability, and the contrast made me ache with a longing I could not control, a desire so sharp and consuming that it cut through my anger like a blade of fire, leaving me trembling, wanting, and furious all at once. And I realized that nothing I had ever experienced compared to the intoxicating danger of wanting a woman who could betray me and still make me burn with need. She approached me that evening, her steps careful but deliberate, her eyes seeking mine with a vulnerability I had come to recognize, a vulnerability I knew could be weaponized against me. And yet I found myself melting under it, forgetting, if only for a moment, that she had been trained to manipulate, trained to seduce, trained to infiltrate and betray, because the pull she exerted was more powerful than any strategy I had ever employed, more irresistible than any temptation I had ever faced, and the realization that I was both prey and predator in her orbit sent a thrill through me that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating, leaving me on edge, consumed by the need to claim, punish, and possess her in ways that I had never allowed myself with anyone else. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling, a soft admission that should have made me recoil, that should have confirmed my suspicions that every smile, every touch, every whispered promise had been carefully calculated. Yet instead it ignited something darker within me, because in that confession lay the truth I had been craving, the vulnerability she could not mask, the admission that despite the deception, despite the danger, despite the lies, she felt the same gravity I did, the same compulsion, the same uncontrollable pull toward me that made every rational thought impossible. And I realized that we were both captives of the same fire, the same obsession, and that neither of us could escape it even if we wanted to. I pulled her close, my hands bracing against the walls of my office, my body pressing against hers in a way that was equal parts dominance and desperation. And I felt the tremor in her body, the rapid beat of her pulse beneath my hands. And I knew with an intensity that left my chest tight and my mind spinning that this was more than lust, more than desire, more than the dangerous thrill of power. It was a collision of wills, of secrets, of obsession and love entwined in a way that neither of us could untangle without tearing ourselves apart. And the thought made me ache with a dark, insatiable hunger that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the fact that she was hers, mine, and neither, all at once. We circled each other in that charged silence, each step, each shift in weight, each subtle movement a test of trust, a dance of control and surrender, because neither of us could fully admit how much we needed the other without exposing ourselves to danger. And yet the need simmered, undeniable, pressing against every restraint we had tried to maintain, threatening to ignite into a fire that would consume everything we had fought to preserve. And I realized with a mixture of fear and exhilaration that the very act of being near her, of feeling her presence, was both a blessing and a weapon, a lure into chaos from which neither of us could escape. She spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the force of an unspoken challenge, and I could feel the weight of every word, every hesitation, every carefully chosen syllable, because I knew that despite the danger, despite the betrayal, she was offering me a fragment of truth, a piece of herself she had not yet fully revealed, and I recognized in that moment that trust, in our world, was a currency more precious than gold, more lethal than a gun, more intoxicating than any drug. And I understood that every interaction, every touch, every glance between us would be a negotiation of that currency from this day forward. "You have to know something," she said, stepping closer, her hands brushing against mine, the warmth of her skin a shock that sent tremors through my body. And I realized that even in the shadow of deception, even in the haze of suspicion and anger, I was powerless to resist, because the pull she exerted was gravitational, inescapable, a force that had already claimed me without permission, without consent, and I knew with a terrifying clarity that nothing I had ever known about control or dominance applied here, because with Lena, every rule, every law, every calculated move I had mastered was meaningless in the face of what we were becoming together. And yet, as she spoke, as her confession began to unravel in small, dangerous threads, I felt my anger simmering beneath the surface, a dark, potent thing that sharpened my instincts and my need simultaneously, because the very fact that she had been trained, prepared, and sent into my life as a weapon was a betrayal I could not simply overlook. And yet the tenderness, the vulnerability, the undeniable fire of our connection made it impossible to punish her fully, impossible to turn away, impossible to deny the magnetic pull that had already bound us in ways neither of us could control. We fell into each other then, not with the gentle intimacy of ordinary lovers, but with the dangerous, consuming passion of two forces colliding, a storm that threatened to swallow us whole because desire and trust, lust and suspicion, anger and longing, all collided in a way that left no room for caution, no space for hesitation, no possibility of retreat. And as I pressed her to me, as I felt her tremble and resist and surrender simultaneously, I understood that this was more than a moment of passion. It was a declaration of war and truce all at once, a recognition that the fire between us could destroy us or bind us in ways the world would never comprehend, and that there would be no turning back from what we had begun. By the time we drew apart, breathless and trembling, the city outside my windows a muted reflection of the chaos inside, I knew with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty that our bond had shifted, irrevocably, dangerously, and that the path forward would demand more than desire, more than passion, more than loyalty. It would demand the surrender of control, the reckoning of trust, and the acceptance that our lives, our hearts, and our empires were now irrevocably entwined in a way that left no room for anything but obsession, devotion, and the perilous thrill of loving someone who could destroy you as easily as they could save you. and as she pressed her forehead against mine, her breath mingling with mine, her body warm and trembling, I realized that the game we were playing had escalated beyond strategy, beyond manipulation, beyond seduction, into territory I had never dared to explore. A territory where love and obsession, betrayal and desire, survival and surrender collided with the intensity of a storm. And I knew, with a pulse-quickening certainty, that there would be no escaping it, no disentangling ourselves from the fire we had ignited, and that the next move, the next revelation, the next choice, would determine not only our hearts, but the very foundations of everything we had fought to protect. Because in Lena, I had discovered a force as dangerous as any enemy I had ever faced, a passion as consuming as any battle I had ever fought, and a love as intoxicating as it was lethal. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that there was no turning back from the storm we had created, no safety to be found, and no victory to be won that did not carry the price of obsession, trust, and the perilous exhilaration of surrendering to someone who could destroy you with a single glance, a single touch, a single whisper. The night air was thick with tension, the kind that crawls beneath your skin and sets every nerve on edge, and I could feel it pressing against my chest like a physical weight, because nothing in my life had ever prepared me for the collision of desire, obsession, and danger that now consumed my existence. And yet there I was, standing shoulder to shoulder with Lena, the woman who had betrayed me and yet captured me so completely that the thought of her absence felt like the slow unraveling of my very soul. And I knew, with a certainty that made my pulse spike and my hands tremble, that whatever came next, whatever storm the world hurled at us, would demand every ounce of strength, every shred of trust, and every ounce of reckless devotion I had left to give. We had received word of a rival faction moving against my operation, a group with teeth sharpened by envy, greed, and ambition, who believed that my empire could be fractured, my control undermined, and my power stolen with a well-timed strike. And I had spent years learning to anticipate threats like this, to orchestrate responses with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Yet even as I directed my men, coordinated defenses, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation, I could not ignore the storm swirling in my chest. The knowledge that Lena was not merely at my side, but a wild card, a force capable of both saving us and destabilizing everything I had worked for. And the tension of that duality made my blood run hotter than any battle I had ever fought. She moved beside me with a predator's grace, alert, poised, scanning every shadow, every corridor, every potential hiding place as if she could anticipate the enemy's next move before they themselves had conceived it. And I found my eyes drawn to her repeatedly, drinking in the way her hair caught the dim light, the subtle flex of her muscles beneath the fitted jacket she wore, the intensity of her gaze that suggested both skill and secret vulnerability. And I realized, as my pulse hammered against my ribs, that even in the midst of impending violence, the need to claim her, to protect her, to press her against me and feel the shiver of tension that ran through her body in response to my proximity, was stronger than the fear of the battle itself, stronger than any threat posed by rival men with guns, knives, or grudges. The first wave of the attack came suddenly, violently, with the abruptness of a storm breaking over a calm sea, gunfire tearing through the night, shouts mingling with the metallic smell of blood and fear, and I felt the familiar rush, the adrenaline, the controlled chaos that I had always thrived in. Except this time, Lena was not just a liability to manage. She was a partner, a co-conspirator in the dance of survival, and her presence made everything sharper, more dangerous, more intoxicating, because she moved not only with skill, but with an intuitive knowledge of me, of my instincts, of the exact timing and angle required to survive and dominate. And in that moment, I realized that the same woman who had infiltrated my heart and my life could also be my salvation in ways I had never anticipated. I shouted orders, bullets tearing past us, men falling, chaos erupting around us, Yet I could not take my eyes off her, because every movement she made was deliberate, lethal, and mesmerizing, and I felt a twisted thrill, a potent mix of fear and desire, because she had become both my anchor and my weapon, someone who could save my life or destroy it with a single miscalculated decision. And the knowledge of that duality made my chest tighten, my blood surge, and my thoughts spiral with a combination of longing, anger, and admiration that I had never allowed myself to feel for anyone. We fought side by side, a lethal unit of chaos and instinct, her presence pushing me into extremes I had never known, forcing me to anticipate not only the enemy but the unpredictable brilliance she brought to every move. And as the last of the attackers fell, leaving the alley strewn with the aftermath of violence, I felt both relief and exhilaration, because we had survived, because we had dominated, and because even as my body ached from the intensity of the fight, my mind and my heart were irrevocably bound to the woman who had proven herself not just a lover, but a force capable of matching me in every way that mattered. And yet even in the triumph, I felt the lingering prick of unease, because she had secrets, and secrets in our world were currency more dangerous than bullets. Later, as we surveyed the aftermath from the rooftop of my mansion, the city sprawled beneath us in glowing, dangerous shadows. I felt her shift beside me, close enough for me to feel the warmth of her body, close enough for the subtle brush of her hair against my arm to send shivers of desire and obsession running through me. And I realized that this proximity, this intimate danger, this collision of our lives in the eye of chaos, had only intensified the pull between us, had made every touch, every glance, every shared breath charged with a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Because in her, I saw both threat and salvation, betrayal and devotion, lust and love, entwined so completely that the boundaries between them had ceased to exist. "You're playing a dangerous game," I murmured, my voice low, harsh, a blend of warning and desire that left no room for denial, because the truth was unavoidable, undeniable, and yet I could not resist the magnetic pull of her presence, the way her eyes met mine, unflinching and honest, in the midst of danger and after revelation. A reminder that even betrayal carried a seductive, intoxicating power, and that the woman I had fought to dominate, to possess, to control, had become my equal, my partner, and my obsession in ways that terrified me. "And so are you," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering, her hand brushing mine, a fleeting, deliberate touch that sent currents through me. And I knew with an intensity that left me breathless that we were both trapped in a web of our own creation, bound by desire, obsession, danger, and the knowledge that every next move would define not only our survival, but the unbreakable, addictive bond that had formed between us. A bond forged in fire, blood, and stolen moments of intimacy that neither of us could resist, and that neither of us could deny. As the night deepened, as shadows lengthened and the city hummed with a dangerous, electric pulse, I felt the first flicker of a truth I had been avoiding. We could survive the rival factions. We could navigate the chaos of our empires. We could fight the wars around us. But the real battle, the one that would test everything I had built, everything I desired, and everything I loved, was inside this room, inside my heart, and inside the fragile, dangerous connection between us. Because Lena was no longer just a spy, no longer just a lover, no longer just a danger. I was inextricably, irrevocably, dangerously entangled in her life and her secrets, and there was no turning back, no escape, and no guarantee that survival would come without sacrifice. And as she leaned against me, her warmth pressing into my chest, her gaze locked with mine, I understood, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that the firestorm we had ignited in each other was only beginning, that every next moment would demand loyalty, trust, and surrender in ways I had never experienced, and that the world outside, with all its violence, ambition, and danger, was nothing compared to the storm within. The storm of desire, obsession, and love that bound us so completely that survival, passion, and betrayal were now inseparable, intertwined in a dance we could not stop, and that would define the rest of our lives, whether we survived it or not. Because in Lena, I had found my greatest ally, my most dangerous threat, and the only force capable of consuming me entirely, and I knew, with every breath, that I could not, would not, survive without her, even if the very act of being with her carried the risk of total annihilation. The morning after the firestorm, the city felt different, more dangerous, more suffocating, more alive with threat, and I could feel it pressing down on me like a weight I could not shake, because every shadow seemed to carry a whisper of betrayal, every flicker of movement a potential ambush, and every heartbeat reminded me that the woman I desired, the woman I had fought to claim, the woman who had become the axis of my obsession, was still a mystery, still a threat, and still impossibly, irreversibly entwined with me in ways I could neither control nor fully understand. And that truth left me both exhilarated and terrified, because desire and danger had merged in my chest, and I could not separate one from the other without fracturing entirely. I found her in the study, her posture casual, yet everything about her radiated alertness, precision, and the faintest flicker of guilt or fear, an imperfection she rarely allowed herself to display, and I could not help the surge of possessiveness that rose in me, a need so sharp and consuming that it made my teeth ache, my palms sweat, and my pulse drum in my ears, because even after surviving bullets and betrayal, even after feeling the heat of her body pressed against mine in the chaos of the previous night, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that Lena was still both mine and not mine, still a force beyond my control, still capable of undoing everything I had built in a heartbeat, and the duality of that knowledge left me raw, desperate, and dangerously alive in ways I could neither resist nor suppress. "Did you sleep?" I asked, my voice low, deliberate, a thread of command weaving through the concern I could not hide, and I saw her flinch slightly at the sound, at the sharpness beneath the surface, at the undeniable gravity of my presence, and I realized with a jolt that even in the quiet of the morning, in the supposed safety of my walls, she could not fully escape the consequences of the truth she carried, the betrayal she had confessed, or the obsession she had ignited in me, and that realization sent a thrill and a pang of pain through my chest simultaneously. "I couldn't," she admitted, her voice soft, careful, and yet laced with something I could not quite name, fear, longing, regret, and I felt a strange, twisted relief, because in that confession lay both vulnerability and honesty, the only currency that had any meaning between us now. And I realized that even as she trembled beneath the weight of her own secrets, I was equally trembling beneath the gravity of my feelings for her. A man who had spent a lifetime building walls around desire, around trust, around love, only to have them shattered by the precise combination of danger, beauty, and brilliance that she carried like a weapon. I stepped closer, feeling the warmth of her body, the tremor in her hands, the rapid beat of her pulse beneath her shirt, and I understood, with a clarity that made my chest ache and my mind spin, that I wanted her in every way, every part of her, every secret she carried, every dangerous impulse, and that desire had become a hunger I could not control, a storm that would not abate, and a fire that threatened to consume both of us if we did not learn to navigate it. Because the truth of Lena's existence was more dangerous than any bullet, more lethal than any rival, and more intoxicating than any addiction I had ever known. But the tension, the obsession, the fire between us was not the only storm I faced. My men were restless, whispers of doubt threading through their ranks, questions about Lena's loyalty, my judgment, and the stability of my empire. And I felt the pressure of their eyes, their suspicion, pressing against me with the same weight as the city outside, a constant reminder that love in my world was a luxury, that desire was a liability, and that obsession, no matter how consuming, could not shield me from the consequences of miscalculation, betrayal, or exposure. I tried to reconcile the two forces, the internal storm of desire and the external threat of enemies and loyalty. But the collision of the two left me raw, on edge, and dangerously unsteady. Because every decision, every glance at Lena, every instinctual move I made in the world of power and violence was now tinged with a need I could not hide, a need that rivaled my instinct for survival, and a vulnerability I had spent years convincing myself would never exist, only to discover that it was alive, urgent, and unrelenting in the presence of a woman who had entered my life as a spy, a threat, and a temptation, and yet had become everything I craved and feared simultaneously. She watched me as I brooded, as I considered strategies and contingencies, as I contemplated both the empire I had built and the woman who had dismantled my certainty with a single revelation, and I could see the flicker of tension in her eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, the way her hands twisted nervously, and I realized, with a jolt of both desire and suspicion, that she was thinking too, calculating too, hiding too, and that every smile, every gesture, every word carried a weight I could not fully measure, a potential threat that could undo us both, and a temptation I could not resist. "Do you trust me?" I asked finally, my voice low, almost a growl, because the question itself carried danger, vulnerability, and obsession, and because the answer would determine not only how I moved forward with her, but whether I could navigate the precarious balance of desire, suspicion, and power without destroying everything I had fought for. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes searching mine, and in that moment, I saw everything I had feared and everything I had hoped for reflected in the depths of her gaze. Regret, longing, defiance, fear, desire, and the undeniable pull of the storm that had bound us together, and I realized that whatever she said, whatever she did, whatever secrets remained hidden, we were now locked in a collision course that neither of us could avoid, and that the consequences would be catastrophic if we faltered, if we misjudged, if we let desire outweigh caution or obsession outweigh survival. I want you to trust me," she whispered, her voice trembling, and I felt my chest tighten, my blood run hot, and my body react in ways I could not suppress, because the admission was equal parts plea and declaration, a recognition that despite deception, despite danger, despite betrayal, she was invested in this, invested in me, in us, in the firestorm we had ignited, and I knew, with a shiver of both thrill and fear, that I could not deny her, could not resist her, and could not retreat from the perilous path that now defined every beat of my heart and every thought in my mind. And yet, as we moved closer, as I reached for her, as the storm of desire and obsession threatened to swallow us whole, a sharp, violent sound shattered the fragile intimacy, a gunshot echoing from the shadows of the city below, followed by another, then another, a symphony of violence that reminded me, with brutal clarity, that the world outside was as dangerous as the storm within, and that every decision we had made, every moment of trust, every confession of desire, was about to be tested in ways that could destroy us both. I grabbed her hand, my grip tight, my pulse racing, and we ran toward the source, toward the chaos, toward the inevitability of confrontation, knowing that survival, love, trust, and obsession would all be measured against the sharp edge of bullets, the weight of betrayal, and the firestorm of emotions we had created together. And I realized, with every nerve alive and every instinct screaming, that nothing in my life had ever mattered more than this moment, this woman, and the storm that now demanded we face it as one, or be destroyed apart. And as we reached the alley where shadows twisted like knives and figures emerged from the darkness, I understood with a pulse-thundering certainty that the next move, the next revelation, the next breath we drew would define not only our survival, but the irreversibly entwined fate of our hearts, and that the cliffhanger hanging over us was not the bullets or the enemies, but the dangerous, intoxicating, unbreakable bond that neither of us could escape, and that the moment of truth, the point of no return, had arrived. The night was alive with tension, every shadow stretched long and jagged beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, every whisper of wind carrying a threat, a promise, and an echo of the chaos we had both unleashed in our hearts. And I could feel it all pressing against me, a storm that had been building for days, weeks, months, and now demanded release because the world we had fought to survive. The empire I had carved with blood, the life I had built with control and fear, was colliding with the storm inside me. The storm that was Lena. The woman who had betrayed me and yet consumed me in ways no gun, no rival, and no strategy could ever replicate. And I knew, with a pulse-quickening certainty, that tonight would decide everything. Whether we survived or perished. Whether love endured or was extinguished in fire. She was at my side, poised, lethal, and yet vulnerable in ways that made my chest ache. Her hand brushing against mine like a silent declaration, a fragile acknowledgement that despite every secret, every deception, every lie we had navigated, we were tethered to each other in ways that defied reason, defied strategy, defied survival itself. And I realized that no enemy, no ambush, no betrayal outside could ever harm me as deeply as the thought of losing her, of letting her walk away, of acknowledging that desire and obsession had rewritten the rules of my life in a way I had never anticipated and could not undo. The first gunshot rang out, sharp, violent, a punctuation in the tense silence of the alley where shadows writhed like serpents, and instinct took over, my body moving faster than thought. My senses heightened to a level I had always known, but never felt so intimately. And I felt Lena move beside me, precise, agile, every step she took a calculated risk and a declaration of loyalty. And I realized with a thrill and a shiver that she had become more than a lover, more than a spy, more than a temptation. She was my partner in the storm, a force that matched me in skill, in fire, in instinct, and in the dangerous, intoxicating chaos that had defined the last months of our lives. We moved as one, a single, lethal unit of instinct and desire, weaving through the gunfire and the shouts of men who had underestimated us both. And I felt the heady, dizzying intoxication of being alive in the purest, sharpest sense, where every heartbeat, every breath, every glance carried the weight of mortality, obsession, and desire. And yet in that chaos, in the eye of danger, I saw Lena not as a threat, not as a spy, not as a complication, but as the only constant I could trust, the only force I could rely on, the only flame capable of illuminating the darkness in which I thrived and feared. The fight was brutal, precise, and deadly, but we emerged, not unscathed, yet victorious, the bodies of enemies and the echoes of their defeat marking our path. And I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken acknowledgement that every near miss, every shared breath of fear, every instinctive move that saved the other, had deepened the bond between us, had stitched together desire, trust, and obsession into something fragile, lethal, and beautiful. And I knew that nothing, no enemy, no betrayal, no secret, could undo what we had forged in fire and blood. We collapsed against each other afterward, leaning in the quiet of the safe room I had prepared, our bodies slick with sweat, our hearts racing. And I felt every ounce of control I had ever prided myself on slip away, leaving only raw, unfiltered need, the kind that makes a man both ferocious and vulnerable, both dominant and desperate. And I realized that in Lena, I had found the only person capable of matching the storm inside me, the chaos that defined who I was, and the love I had refused to permit myself until now. I thought I could control everything, I admitted, my voice hoarse, low, trembling with a mixture of anger, desire, and relief. My empire, my men, my life. And then you walked in. And everything I knew about control, about power, about love, it all shattered. She tilted her head, her eyes glistening in the dim light, a shadow of a smile curving her lips, the kind of smile that could wound and heal simultaneously. And she whispered, "I didn't plan to fall either. I was trained to deceive, to survive, to manipulate. But I couldn't resist you, not even when I tried." I pulled her closer, my hands pressed against the small of her back, feeling her heartbeat pound in rhythm with my own. And I realized with an ache that this truth, this confession, this collision of desire and honesty, was more terrifying and more intoxicating than any gunfight, any strategy, any empire, because it laid bare the fragile human core of both of us, the part that craved trust, love, and surrender, even when logic screamed against it. "I don't care about your mission," I said finally, the words tasting like fire on my tongue. The command and confession rolled into one, because I could no longer separate possession from desire, control from obsession, love from survival, and every fiber of my being demanded that she understand that loyalty, secrecy, and danger had no place here. Between us, there was only truth, only fire, only surrender. Her lips met mine then, tentative at first, then with a ferocity that mirrored my own, and I felt the tension of months, the weight of betrayal, the rush of obsession, dissolve into something pure, something irrevocable, something that could neither be undone nor ignored. And in that kiss, I understood that love had become a weapon as powerful as any gun, any empire, any threat, and that desire had fused with trust in a way that made the world outside irrelevant, meaningless, and distant. We pulled apart only slightly, foreheads pressed together, breaths mingling, hearts beating in synchrony, and I knew with a clarity that cut sharper than any blade that our story was far from over, that the path ahead would still be lined with danger, enemies, and secrets, but that we had survived the storm, faced the fire, and emerged with something far more precious than victory. The knowledge that we belonged to each other in a way neither of us could escape, deny, or resist, and that the storm between us had become our strength, our bond, and our obsession. The city outside was quiet now, the echoes of violence fading into the night, but I could feel the pulse of it in the walls, in the air, in the dark corners of the empire I had built. And I realized, with a reflective, almost poetic awareness, that life would always be dangerous, always be chaotic, and always demand vigilance. Yet within that chaos I had found something rare, something unshakable, something that no betrayal, no threat, no storm could extinguish. Lena, and the firestorm she had ignited within me. I held her close, feeling the tremor of relief and desire that ran through her body, and I whispered, almost to myself, almost in reverence, "We survived the fire, the betrayal, the danger. And yet here we are. Still burning, still alive, still us. Nothing can take that from us." And as we stood together in the quiet aftermath, the city stretching beneath us like a canvas of shadows and light, I understood, with a pulse-throbbing certainty, that life would continue to test us, that enemies would come, that secrets might rise again, but that for the first time in my life, I was not alone in the storm, not merely surviving, but living, desiring, and surrendering in the only way that truly mattered. And I realized that love, obsession, danger, and redemption were inseparable, and that I had finally found a balance in the chaos, a flame in the darkness, and a reason to burn brighter than any city, any empire, any shadow could ever contain. And in that moment, holding her, feeling her heartbeat against mine, the city alive with distant echoes of a world we had mastered and survived, I knew with a poetic, aching clarity that desire and danger had brought us together. Betrayal and obsession had forged us. And love, raw and unrelenting, would carry us through every fire yet to come. Because in Lena, I had found my reckoning, my redemption, and my home.